The Song of Roland is an epic poem based on the Battle of Roncevaux in 778, during the reign of Charlemagne. It is the oldest surviving major work of French literature and exists in various manuscript versions, which testify to its enormous and enduring popularity in the 12th to 14th centuries. The date of composition is put in the period between 1040 and 1115, and early version beginning around 1040 with additions and alterations made up. Until about 1115, the final text has about 4,000 lines of poetry. The epic poem is the first and, along with the poem of the Cid, one of the most outstanding examples of the chanson de geste, a literary form that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries and celebrated legendary deeds. Manuscripts and dating. Set in the Carolingian era, it was written much later. There are 9 extant manuscripts of the Song of Roland in Old French. The oldest of these manuscripts is held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. This copy dates between 1129 and 1165 and was written in Anglo-Norman. Scholars estimate that the poem was written, possibly by a poet named Harold, between approximately 1040 and 1115, and most of the alterations were performed by about 1098. Some favor an earlier dating, because it allows one to say that the poem was inspired by the Castilian campaigns of the 1030s, and that the poem went on to be a major influence in the First Crusade. Those who prefer later dating do so on grounds of what they interpret as brief references made in the poem to events of the First Crusade. In the poem, the term d'Oultremer or l'Oultremérant comes up 3 times in reference to named Muslims who came from Outremer to fight in Spain and France. Outremer, modern French outremer, literally oversea, beyond sea, other side of the sea, is a native French term from the classical Latin roots ultra equals beyond, amer equals sea. The name was commonly used by the Crusaders for Palestine. The occurrence of this term in the poem cannot be interpreted as showing influence from the Crusades in the poem. On the contrary, the way it is used in the poem, in which it is simply a Muslim land, indicates that the author of the poem was unacquainted with the Crusades, and that the term was in French before the Crusades began, meaning the far side of the Mediterranean Sea. The bulk of the poem is adjudged to date from before the Crusades, but there are a few items where questions remain about these items being late additions shortly after the Crusade started. Critical opinions. Oral performance of the song compared to manuscript versions. Scholarly consensus has long accepted that the Song of Roland differed in its presentation depending on oral or textual transmission, namely, although a number of different versions of the song containing varying material and episodes would have been performed orally, the transmission to manuscript resulted in greater cohesiveness across versions. Early editors of the Song of Roland, informed in part by patriotic desires to produce a distinctly French epic, could thus overstate the textual cohesiveness of the Roland tradition. This point is clearly expressed by Andrew Taylor, who notes, Roland's song was, if not invented, at the very least constructed, by supplying it with an appropriate epic title, isolating it from its original codicological context, and providing a general history of minstrel performance in which its pure origin could be located. The early editors presented a 4,002-line poem as sung French epic. Plot: Charlemagne's army is fighting the Muslims in Spain. They have been there for 7 years, and the last city standing is Saragossa, held by the Muslim king Marsil. Threatened by the might of Charlemagne's army of Franks, Marsil seeks advice, and his wise man, Blancandran, counsels him to conciliate the emperor, offering to surrender and giving hostages. Accordingly, Marsil sends out messengers to Charlemagne, promising trade treasure and Martial's conversion to Christianity if the Franks will go back to France. Charlemagne and his men, tired of fighting, accept his peace offer and select a messenger to Martial's court. Protagonist Roland, Charlemagne's nephew, nominates his stepfather Ganelon as messenger. Ganelon, who fears to be murdered by the enemy and accuses Roland of intending this, takes revenge by informing the Saracens of a way to ambush the rear guard of Charlemagne's army, led by Roland. As the Franks re-enter Spain through the mountain passes, as Ganelon predicted, Roland leads the rear guard, with the wise and moderate Oliver and the fierce Archbishop Turpin. The Muslims ambush them at Roncevaux, and the Christians are overwhelmed. Oliver asks Roland to blow his oliphant to call for help from the Frankish army, but Roland proudly refuses to do so. It is for this reason that Roland is often accused of pride by critics of the Song of Roland. The Franks fight well, but are outnumbered until almost all Roland's men are dead, and he knows that Charlemagne's army can no longer save them. Despite this, he blows his oliphant to summon revenge, until his temples burst and he dies a martyr's death. Angels take his soul to paradise. When Charlemagne and his men reach the battlefield, they find the dead bodies of Roland's men, who have been utterly annihilated, and pursue the Muslims into the river Ebro, where they drown. Meanwhile, Balagant, the powerful emir of Babylon, has arrived in Spain to help Martial, and his army encounters that of Charlemagne at Roncevaux, where the Christians are burying and mourning the dead. Both sides fight valiantly. When Charlemagne kills Balagant, the Muslim army scatters and flees, and the Franks conquer Saragossa. With Martial's wife Bramimond, Queen of Saragossa, Charlemagne and his men ride back to exit their capital in France. The Franks discover Ganelon's betrayal and keep him in chains until his trial, where Ganelon argues that his action was legitimate revenge, not treason. While the Council of Barons assembles to decide the traitor's fate is initially swayed by this claim. One man, Thierry, argues that, because Roland was serving Charlemagne when Ganelon delivered his revenge on him, Ganelon's action constitutes a betrayal. Ganelon's friend Pinabel challenges Thierry to trial by combat, in which, by divine intervention, Thierry kills Pinabel. The Franks are convinced by this of Ganelon's treason. Thus, he is torn apart by having 4 galloping horses tied one to each arm and leg, and 30 of his relatives are hanged. Form. The poem is written in stanzas of a irregular length known as laces. The lines are decasyllabic, and each is divided by a strong C0 which generally falls after the 4th syllable. The last stress syllable of each line in a les has the same vowel sound as every other end syllable in that les. The les is therefore an asnal, not a rhyming stanza. On a narrative level, the Song of Roland features extensive use of repetition, parallelism, and thesis-antithesis pairs. Roland proposes Ganelon for the dangerous mission to Saragossa. Ganelon designates Roland to man the rearguard. Charlemagne is contrasted with Balagant. Unlike later Renaissance and Romantic literature, the poem focuses on action rather than introspection. The characters are presented through what they do, not through what they think or feel. The narrator gives few explanations for characters' behavior. The warriors are stereotypes defined by a few salient traits. For example, Roland is loyal and trusting, while Ganelon, though brave, is traitorous and vindictive. The narrator is openly biased towards the Franks. His moral view is very black and white. The Franks are good, and the pagans are bad. The story moves at a fast pace, occasionally slowing down and recounting the same scene up to 3 times, but focusing on different details and taking a different perspective each time. The effect is similar to a film sequence shot at different angles so that new and more important details come to light with each shot. Characters. principal characters: Andriados, helpless boy, despite the honor came from King Charlemagne. Balagant, emir of Babylon, Marsial enlists his help against Charlemagne. Blancandran, wise pagan, suggests bribing Charlemagne out of Spain with hostages and gifts, and then suggests dishonoring a promise to allow Marsial's baptism. Basalt came from the name of rocks that are solid and maybe occur in the second phrase of the poem. Raptured the horse of the king. Ramimonde, queen of Saragossa, King Marsial's wife, captured and converted by Charlemagne after the city falls. Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor, his forces fight the Saracens in Spain. Ganelon, treacherous lord and Roland's stepfather who encourages Marsial to attack the French army. King Marsial, Saracen king of Spain, Roland wounds him and he dies of his wound later. Naiman, Charlemagne's trusted advisor. Oliver, Roland's friend, mortally wounded by Margrice. He represents wisdom. Roland, the hero of the song, nephew of Charlemagne, leads the rear guard of the French forces, bursts his temples by blowing his own life and torn wounds from which he eventually dies facing the enemy's land. Turpin, Archbishop of Reims, represents the force of the Church. Secondary characters: Aude, the fiancée of Roland and Oliver's sister. Bissan, French baron, murdered while serving as ambassador of Marsial. Berengier, one of the 12 paladins killed by Marsial's troops, kills Estramarin, killed by Grandoin. Biscun, chief cook of Charlemagne's army, guards Ganelon after Ganelon's treachery is discovered. Gerboin, guards the French dead, becomes leader of Charlemagne's second column. Godefroy, standard-bearer of Charlemagne, brother of Thierry, Charlemagne's defender against Pinabel. Grandoin, fighter on Marsial's side, son of the Cappadocian king Capurel, kills Carine. Carrier, Berenger, Guy Street, Antoine, and Duke Astorge, killed by Roland. Hamon, joint commander of Charlemagne's 8th Division. Laurent, French commander of one of the first divisions against Balagant, killed by Balagant. Milan, guards the French dead while Charlemagne pursues the Saracen forces. Ogier, a Dane who leads the 3rd E column in Charlemagne's army against Balagant's forces. Othon, guards the French dead while Charlemagne pursues the Saracen forces. Pinabel, fights for Ganelon in the judicial combat. Thierry, fights for Charlemagne in the judicial combat. Durandal. According to the Song of Roland, this legendary sword was first given to Charlemagne by an angel. It contained one tooth of St. Peter, blood of St. Basil, hair of St. Denis, and a piece of the raiment of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and was supposedly the sharpest sword in all existence. In the story of the Song of Roland, the weapon is given to Roland, and he uses it to defend himself single-handedly against thousands of Muslim attackers. According to one 12th century legend from the French town of Rocamadour, Roland threw the sword into a cliffside. You can still see the sword embedded into the cliff face. Historical adaptations. A Latin poem, Carmen de Productione Canonis, was composed around 1120, and a Latin prose version, Historia Caroli Magni, even earlier. Around 1170, a version of the French poem was translated into the Middle High German Roland slide by Conrad d'Afa. In his translation, Conrad replaces French topics with generically Christian ones. The work was translated into Middle Dutch in the 13th century. It was also rendered into Occitan verse in the 14th or 15th century poem of Roncevaux, which incorporates the later Southern aesthetic into the story. An Old Norse version of the Song of Roland exists as Carlomagne's Saga, and a translation into the artificial literary language of Franco-Venetian is also known. Such translations contributed to the awareness of the story in Italy. In 1516, Ludovico Ariosto published his epic Orlando Furioso, which deals largely with characters first described in the Song of Roland. There is also Faroese adoption of this ballad named Roncevaux Trideth. The ballad is one of many sung during the Faroese folk dance tradition of chain dancing. Modern adaptations. The Chanson de Roland has an important place in the background of Graham Greene's The Confidential Agent. The book's protagonist had been a medieval scholar specializing in this work, until the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War forced him to become a soldier and secret agent. Throughout the book, he repeatedly compares himself and other characters with the characters of Roland. Particularly, the book includes a full 2 pages of specific commentary, which is relevant to its 20th century plotline. Oliver, when he saw the Saracens coming, urged Roland to blow his horn and fetch back Charlemagne, but Roland wouldn't blow. A big brave fool. In war one always chooses the wrong hero. Oliver should have been the hero of that song, instead of being given second place with the bloodthirsty Bishop Turpin. In the Oxford version, Oliver is reconciled in the end. He gives Roland his death blow by accident, his eyes blinded by wounds. The story had been tidied up. In truth, Oliver strikes his friend down in full knowledge, because of what he has done to his men, all the wasted lives. Oliver dies hating the man he loves, the big boasting courageous fool who was more concerned with his own glory than with the victory of his faith. This makes the story tragedy, not just heroics. It is also adapted by Stephen King in the Dark Tower series, in which Roland Deschain wishes to save the Dark Tower from the Crimson King. The Song of Roland is part of the Matter of France, and related to Orlando Furioso. The names Roland and Orlando are cognates. Emmanuel Luzzatti's animated short film, I Paladini di Francia, together with Giulio Giannini, in 1960, was turned into the children's picture storybook with verse narrative I Paladini di Francia ovvero il tradimento di Gano di Magans, which translates literally as The Paladins of France of the Treachery of Gano of Magans. This was then republished in English as Ronald and the Wizard Calico. The Picture Lion paperback edition is a paperback imprint of the Hutchinson Junior Books edition, which credits the English translation to Hutchinson Junior Books. Luzzatti's original verse story in Italian is about the plight of a beautiful maiden called Bianca Fiore, White Flower, or Blanchefla, and her brave hero, Captain Ronaldo, and Riccardo and his paladins, the term used for Christian knights engaged in crusades against the Saracens and more, battling with these good people of the wicked Moors, North African Muslims and Arabs, and the Sultan, in Jerusalem, with the assistance of the wicked and treacherous magician, Gano of Magans. Bianca Fiore is stolen from her fortress castle, and taken to become the reluctant wife of the Sultan. The catalyst for victory is the good magician Erlabulu, who lives in a lake, and flies through the air on the back of his magic blue bird. The English translators, using the original illustrations and the basic rhyme patterns, slightly simplify the plot, changing the Christians versus Muslim Moors conflict into a battle between good and bad magicians and between golden knights and green knights. The French traitor in the Song of Roland, who is actually Roland's cowardly stepfather, is Ganelon, very likely the inspiration for Luzzatti's traitor and wicked magician, Gano. Orlando Furioso includes Orlando's cousin, the paladin Ronaldo, who, like Orlando, is also in love with Angelica, a pagan princess. Ronaldo is, of course, the Italian equivalent of Ronald. Flying through the air on the back of a magic bird is equivalent to flying on a magic hippogriff.